On the highway, a couple was arguing in the car. Their relationship was already on the brink of collapse, and the smallest provocation could ignite their fury. Suddenly, a blaring horn from behind startled the husband who was driving. He quickly snapped back to attention, narrowly avoiding an accident. Not long after, their young daughter in the back seat complained about needing to use the restroom. Still shaken, the couple decided to stop at a nearby rest area to cool off with a drink and let their daughter use the bathroom. However, what happened next would plunge this family into an irrecoverable abyss. I invite you to come up with your own theory about what truly happened, and stick around until the end to see if your guess matches the real story. Soon after arriving at the rest area, the wife, Jo, took their daughter to the restroom, while the husband, Ray, went alone to the small convenience store to buy drinks. Ray had a history of alcoholism. Though he had been sober for a long time, the recent argument left him frustrated and craving a drink. He secretly purchased 2 small bottles of alcohol and drank them. As the family was about to leave, the daughter, Peri, noticed her toy mirror was missing. The wife returned to the restroom to look for it while Ray rummaged in the car. In his clumsiness, he spilled coffee, further aggravating his irritation. While Ray was busy cleaning up, the unattended daughter was startled by a large dog that appeared out of nowhere. Frightened, she backed away. By the time Ray noticed, she was at the edge of a deep pit. Behind her was an unfinished construction site with exposed rebar. If she fell, the consequences would be catastrophic. Panicking, Ray grabbed a stone to scare the dog away. To his horror, the daughter, still frightened, fell into the pit. Ray lunged to catch her but failed, falling unconscious in the process. Shortly after, Ray regained consciousness to find his wife cradling their motionless daughter and crying loudly. Seeing Ray awake, she rushed over, demanding to know what had happened. Dazed, Ray shoved her aside and closed his eyes, trying to calm himself. Suddenly, he was jolted back to reality by his daughter's voice. Thankfully, it was a false alarm. She was still alive, seemingly only suffering a broken arm. The full extent of her injuries, however, required a doctor's evaluation. Ray drove at top speed to the nearest hospital with his wife and daughter. The hospital was overcrowded, and the receptionist, visibly impatient, told Ray to register and wait. Relieved that his daughter was alive, Ray complied. While waiting, he noticed medical staff handing a box to an ambulance driver, who then pulled a wad of cash from his pocket and handed it to the staff. It looked like some kind of transaction, leaving Ray uneasy, though he didn't dwell on it. Eventually, it was their turn to see the doctor. As the staff handled the admission process, they asked a series of odd questions, such as Ray's occupation and whether there was a family history of mental illness. Ray thought these had nothing to do with his daughter's broken arm, but answered patiently. The staff then suddenly asked if he would consent to adding his daughter to the organ donor registry. Ray, annoyed, flatly refused. His daughter was so young and only lightly injured. Why would they ask such a bizarre question? The staff seemed reluctant to let it go and continued asking about the girl's blood type. After a lengthy process, the staff informed Ray that his medical insurance still listed his ex-wife as the beneficiary, so it couldn't be used for his daughter. Frustrated, Ray said he'd pay in cash as long as they could treat her quickly. Only then did the staff call in an Asian nurse to take the girl to a room for further examination. The doctor responsible for the examination was an older man with glasses who seemed very kind. While checking the little girl's pupils, he even enthusiastically complimented her on her beautiful eyes. He told Ray and his wife that their daughter appeared to have a minor fracture but might also have sustained a head injury, so it was best to conduct a CT scan. The CT scanning room on the basement level only allowed one family member to accompany the patient. Ray stayed back in the waiting area, exhausted. He sat on a chair and fell into a deep sleep. Several hours passed, and as night fell, Ray suddenly woke up, realizing that his wife and daughter still hadn't returned. Alarmed, he rushed to the front desk to inquire, only to find that the staff had changed shifts. The nurse on duty checked the records and informed Ray that the last recorded use of the scanning room was around 9 a.m., before Ray and his family even arrived at the hospital. In other words, his daughter never underwent a CT scan, and there was no record of her admission in the system. Ray was incredulous. He clearly remembered completing the admission process for his daughter. How could there be no record? He demanded to confront the bespectacled doctor directly, but the nurse informed him that the doctor had already left for the day. Detecting the nurse's impatience, Ray became suspicious that the hospital was hiding something sinister. Determined to find his wife and daughter, Ray sneaked into the patient rooms, but was quickly discovered by security. A scuffle broke out and a bearded doctor on duty arrived to intervene. After listening to Ray's story, the doctor agreed to help and searched through the day's medical records. As Ray claimed, there was no record of his daughter. At that moment, Ray spotted a familiar face, the Asian nurse who had taken his daughter to the exam room earlier. Ray hurried over to plead for her help, hoping she could confirm that his wife and daughter had been at the hospital. To his shock, the nurse denied ever seeing his wife or daughter. Furious, Ray accused the nurse of lying and demanded to know what she had done to his family. His anger escalated, and he nearly resorted to physical confrontation. The nurse, unfazed, suddenly pulled out a sedative syringe and injected Ray without hesitation. The bearded doctor then ordered security to temporarily confine Ray in his office. After everyone left, Ray fought through his dizziness and managed to find a medical kit in the room. He administered a countermeasure to himself, recovering his strength thanks to the medication. Once clear-headed, he escaped the hospital and returned to his car. By now, he was certain that the hospital was hiding something dark. While Ray was contemplating how to rescue his wife and daughter, a police car happened to drive by. He quickly flagged it down and explained the situation to the two officers. The police immediately accompanied Ray back to the hospital to investigate. Security retrieved surveillance footage, but the hospital's outdated equipment produced blurry images at critical moments. Throughout the footage, only Ray appeared on camera. He began to suspect that the hospital had deliberately tampered with the surveillance footage. The police requested the hospital to contact the bespectacled doctor for a face-to-face confrontation with Ray, deciding to check the scanning room in the meantime. The bearded doctor led the group to the third floor, where Ray immediately voiced his doubts. He vividly recalled seeing the medical staff take his wife and daughter to the basement level for a CT scan. The bearded doctor, maintaining an air of sincerity, told the police that the hospital only had one CT scanning room, which was on the third floor. When they inspected the room, they found it filled with CT equipment, and the system logs confirmed the last usage was indeed at 9 a.m., consistent with what the nurse had said earlier. Ray, however, insisted the hospital was hiding something. If his wife and daughter hadn't been brought to the scanning room, they must have been taken elsewhere. He pleaded with the police to search the entire hospital, particularly the basement. While sympathetic, the officers explained that without evidence, they couldn't obtain a search warrant based solely on his claims. At that moment, the bespectacled doctor returned to the hospital. To Ray's shock, the doctor adamantly denied ever seeing Ray's wife or daughter, claiming that Ray was the only patient he had seen that day. The doctor said Ray had a minor head injury and seemed mentally unstable at the time, so he had suggested a brain scan, which Ray refused. He speculated that Ray's supposed brain injury might be causing confusion, mixing reality with hallucinations. To assess Ray's mental state, the bespectacled doctor called in a professional psychiatrist, a female doctor, who gently coaxed Ray into revealing more about himself. Ray admitted to struggling with alcoholism and confessed that 8 years ago he caused a fatal car accident while driving under the influence, killing his pregnant ex-wife. This traumatic event left him emotionally scarred. Hearing this, the psychiatrist concluded that Ray might indeed be experiencing a mental breakdown. She suggested that Ray's wife and daughter were likely dead and that Ray was unable to cope with the loss, leading him to imagine they were still alive. She proposed visiting the site of the alleged dog attack to uncover the truth. The police agreed, and the group, accompanied by a sniffer dog, went to the scene. The dog quickly located a broken piece of jewelry belonging to Ray's daughter at the bottom of a pit, along with a large blood-stained area concealed by dirt. The amount of blood suggested fatal injuries, far beyond what Ray or his daughter's injuries could explain. The psychiatrist hypothesized that Ray had suffered a mental break, imagining the events at the hospital. Under the psychiatrist's guidance, Ray began to recall arguments with his wife and his attempts to drown his sorrows in alcohol. She proposed a horrifying theory. There was never a vicious dog, and Ray fabricated the story. She suggested that in a drunken rage, Ray might have fatally struck his daughter during an argument and then killed his wife. Unable to face the reality, Ray invented the narrative of bringing them to the hospital. Her words were so convincing that Ray started to believe her and broke down crying. The psychiatrist pressed him to reveal the location of the bodies while the police prepared to arrest him. Suddenly, the sound of barking snapped Ray out of his despair.
In a court of law, you have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, you will be provided for.
In the darkness, he saw a familiar large dog, the very one that had terrified his daughter. At that moment, Ray realized the psychiatrist was manipulating him, and the entire hospital scenario was a setup. Even the police seemed deceived. Determined to uncover the truth, Ray overpowered an officer, grabbed a gun, and took the psychiatrist hostage. He locked everyone in a nearby storage room and used the psychiatrist's keycard to drive a police car back to the hospital. Disguised in a doctor's coat, he made his way to the basement. The atmosphere in the basement was eerie. From the shadows, Ray observed medical staff pushing a cart carrying boxes labeled human organs. He remembered seeing a similar box being handed to an ambulance driver earlier, who exchanged it for a stack of cash. It dawned on Ray this was an organ trafficking operation. Shaken, Ray sneaked into an operating room and discovered two young corpses, one with its abdominal cavity hollowed out and the other with its eyes removed. He recalled how the bespectacled doctor had complimented his daughter's beautiful eyes, sending a chill down his spine. Suddenly, Ray noticed a nurse carrying an empty box toward another operating room. He followed her and found his daughter lying unconscious on an operating table, with his wife slumped in a wheelchair nearby. The medical staff had already sedated his daughter and were preparing to harvest her organs. Ray aimed his gun at the staff, forcing them to step back. The lead surgeon removed his mask, revealing himself to be the bearded doctor. He tried to convince Ray that this was all in his imagination, but Ray's wife regained consciousness and exposed the doctor's lies. Hearing his wife's explanation that she had been drugged, Ray firmly cradled his daughter in his arms and placed her gently in his wife's lap. Determined to escape, he began to push them out of the operating room. But before they could leave, several doctors pounced on him, pinning him to the ground. One of them prepared a syringe filled with a sedative. Ray fought back with all his strength, managing to fire a shot at an oxygen tank. The resulting explosion knocked the doctors and nurses unconscious. Amid the chaos, Ray seized the opportunity to escape, carrying his wife and daughter to his car. He carefully placed them in the back seat and sped away toward home, exhilarated to have rescued his family.
Sing a rainbow for you.
However, the reality was far from Ray's perception. The person lying on the operating table had not been his daughter, but a patient awaiting surgery. His wife had not been there either. The wheelchair had been empty. All of it had been a hallucination. The psychiatrist's earlier conclusions were mostly correct. Ray's daughter had fallen into the pit, frightened by the large dog, and tragically died in the fall. Overcome with despair, Ray's wife had screamed at him in anguish. Ray, equally distraught, had lashed out in the heat of the moment and pushed her away. Unluckily, she fell and was fatally impaled on an exposed metal rod. Unable to cope with the enormity of his actions, Ray suppressed the memory of their deaths. He placed their bodies in the trunk of his car and constructed an elaborate fantasy to mask his guilt and trauma. In this imagined reality, his daughter had only suffered minor injuries, and he was no longer the man responsible for his wife's death, but a hero who had saved his family. In the final scene, Ray drives along the road, glancing lovingly at the rearview mirror. Though the backseat is empty, he smiles warmly as if seeing his wife's reflection smiling back at him.
Let's go home.
As the story concludes, viewers are left with an unsettling reminder. A single moment of carelessness or misfortune can spiral into unimaginable consequences. Life is fragile, and we must tread cautiously. That's all for today's recap. See you in the next one.